So before I get serious and tell you about what's going to be on the screen here, I want to just share a little bit about when I wasn't serious about wild horses. And Jay Kirkpatrick and I got into this in the early 1970s, actually, but by the mid-1970s, we were actually studying the process of reproduction in wild horses. Because we needed to learn about it because we wanted to solve the problem of excess reproduction. Uh-oh.
Check that down. What's on?
Is this on? Is it? Yeah, this is on. So, one of the things that we were doing was working in the Pryor Mountains, which was a wonderful place to start because it's right on the edge of the Bighorn Canyon. And we had a BLM pickup truck. It was the usual type of BLM truck they give you, which is, getting close to going on the block for sale, but it still runs. So I loved that truck. And so Jay and I would work down there in the Pryors, and there was this side trip that you could take up over Dead Indian Hill Pass and down through Sunlight Basin, right on the edge of the wilderness areas of the Absaroka Range in Montana. And so one day, we came down that way. I dropped Jay off. I had to go back and get something in Billings. So on my way back, I went up over Dead Indian Hill Pass and out through Sunlight Basin on the way back. When I got back, Jay said, "What took you so long?" And I said, "I went up over Dead Indian Hill Pass." He says, "There's no way I can justify to the BLM that you took this pickup truck back to Billings via Dead Indian Hill Pass." So that was those days. And then I kind of started spending more time with the horses, and I started getting more serious about it. Wasn't about driving the pickup truck around in the middle of nowhere. It was really about trying to find solutions for this population, which even in the 1970s was rapidly growing. We could see it on the horizon. It went from about 17,000 in 1972 to about 80,000 in 1982. So we were seeing this as we started. So I'm going to share with you some facts first, and then talk a little bit about a projection that we've been developing, which has been very helpful to have all this information here today, so it makes it easier for me to talk about it. But also, I wanted to say that it's not just me, but right now I'm co-investigating with several other universities, Ohio State, Purdue University, and UC Davis. And so I have short presentations for each of these. It will just take a couple of minutes so you can see what we're trying to do to further advance the development of PZP-22 vaccine so we get high levels of effectiveness year 1 and year 2 and even possibly beyond. But first, a few facts about PZP vaccine. Dead cells, it's a consequence of getting this far along. So, I think all of you know already that it's important to have background knowledge about PZP contraception before you try to use it. And you need to start off with a trustworthy source of information about the vaccine. And Kim Frank gave some very good beginnings on that today. You need to know what it's made of. You also know how to properly store it, prepare it, and deliver it in the field. And also, time of year of treatment is important, and that was already discussed. For PZP-22, it's best between December and March. And if you'll go back earlier than December, the lower your effectiveness in the second year. Accessibility of the horses is a critical issue. And for the longest time, we only delivered it by hand or jab stick in field corrals. Now we have the capability, as Karen Herman told you, of doing it with a dart. Also, you need to know the population you're working with, and field managers certainly know about that. Secondly, in that category, the identity of individual horses, the mares and their foals. You got to know them well enough so that you know which foals belong to which mares if you're going to try and get information that you can report on effectiveness of a fertility control measure. And also, and one thing I'll talk about in a few minutes is the subject of management potential and the costs that are incurred in trying to do that. And earlier when we were listening to information about POP Equus, we were learning some things about that. PZP vaccine, well, there's the diagram, but you've already heard everything about it. So I don't need to do that. More time for other things. The two most used physical forms of PZP-based vaccine, we already today talked about that. There's native PZB, which is Zonistat H, the EPA-registered version of the vaccine, and there's PZP-22. I would note here, I don't know if you can read this, but in the field studies that were done between 2008 and 2016 in the Annenberg project, which has been reported, which Dr. Ruckberg talked about, we showed that the PZP-22 vaccine treatment followed in 2 to 3 years by a native PZP booster, which would be like the Zonistat H, but without the adjuvant that has the cell walls in it, just the incomplete Freund's adjuvant, which is basically mineral oil and an emulsifying agent, Arlacel A. So with that treatment, PZP-22 first followed in a couple of years by the PZP-FIA. We could get 5 years of effective contraception, averaging about 20% across a 7-year period. So that means that those data in that study have moved us forward considerably from where we started, which was giving 2 injections a month apart to get 1 year of contraception. So we are making progress. And this is published in the journal Wildlife Research. It was published in April of 2017. It's Ruckberg et al. A few facts about primers and pellets. The primer is what Kim already told you. It's an aqueous, half mil. We tested 50 micrograms, 65 micrograms, 100 micrograms, and up to 400 micrograms in a single dose, and found that the best one was between 65 and 100 micrograms, and we use 100 micrograms routinely. Anything above 100 really didn't do anything more in terms of giving you better titers or better contraception. So we didn't use it because it's relatively expensive, about $28 a dose. For the adjuvant, Kim already talked about the adjuvant, the complete modified adjuvant with the cell walls and the incomplete. As far as the quality of the emulsion goes, that has been an issue for a number of years among different applicators in the BLM system. We did periodic trainings, and some people were able to get good emulsions, and others had trouble. And then I would say that one of the failings on my part was with these applicators, I sometimes did not follow up to find out how this was going when they were, because I told them, okay, this is how you do it. They practiced it several times at the training, but then they were off on their own. And it would have been better if I'd have followed up regularly until they got to the point where they could make a really good emulsion, because it's important. The primary emulsion is critical for getting the boosters to do their job properly. And the ideal consistency that we find is somewhere between hand lotion and mayonnaise. I know that's a very useful piece of information. As far as the shelf life of the primer goes, we've found that at 4 to 8 degrees centigrade, which is essentially refrigerator. It's good for about a week in solution, but at room temperature, it's good for less than 24 hours, so we don't trust it anywhere beyond that. The modified Freund's complete adjuvant at room temperature is good for at least 3 days. And the emulsion in a syringe at 4 degrees, which is the temperature what you get when you put it in ice, breaks down in about 2 to 7 hours, and it depends on the initial consistency. And if the emulsion becomes sloppy during the time it's sitting there before it's to be used, it needs to be re-emulsified till it's tight again. And looking at the long term, the PZP is stored at -20 to -40 degrees in our lab, and it retains full bioactivity for more than 5 years in that condition, and probably much longer than that. The modified Freund's complete adjuvant is kept at 4 to 8 degrees centigrade, i.e. refrigerated, and it retains full bioactivity for more than 3 years that way. The controlled release pellets for the PZP are essentially 3 types of polymer to give different delays in release for 1, 3, and 12 months approximately. The PZP is in lyophilized or freeze-dried form, so it's a powder. The QA21 is a powder, which QA21 is the adjuvant we use for the pellets. It's not the same as for the liquid. But it's been vetted. It's a good adjuvant. But we'd like to make it better, and I'll show you how we're trying a little bit. We also include a colored dye so that we can tell the difference between the 1, 3, and 12-month pellet. So otherwise, we could be putting 3 one-month pellets into a 2-year vaccine. In terms of the characteristics, the ingredients of the pellet will survive 120 degrees centigrade, which is well above boiling, whenever it's embedded in the polymer. Now, if it's just raw sitting out, it can't handle being above boiling for long, but it can make it to 120 degrees for 40 minutes and still be viable, bioactive, if it's in the polymer. So the polymer protects it. The pellets are essentially small cylinders. To see what they look like, they're between 1.5 millimeters in diameter and 3 to 4 millimeters in length. And they fit into the barrel of 14-gauge hypodermic needle. In terms of their shelf life, they're stable, frozen, or refrigerated, but they should be stored with a desiccant. They shouldn't be just left out in the air, because moisture is the bad thing for both the polymer and for the active ingredients. So storing them with little desiccant bags in a freezer bag, for example, is a fine way to go. You can also store them inside the hypodermic needles. We use a little bit of Vaseline at each end of the needle so the pellets won't fall out, and that is a pretty protective environment. The best long-term storage for the pellets is between -20 and -40 degrees centigrade for a shelf life of at least 5 years, and likely, again, much longer than that. We're evaluating that now with some very old pellets that we have that are from 2005 and 2007. So the field delivery of this vaccine has been described already, and that's going to be with a trocar in field corrals. And a trocar is very similar to this dart here, except that it doesn't have a powder charge at the back, and the jab stick pushes the plunger forward and pushes the pellets out of the needle into the muscle. We've done some work with quality control and improved efficiency. We started a contract with the BLM last year to produce small amounts of PZP-22 for their use, and we store it at the medical school. We addressed, during the course of this work in preparing this in the contract, we dedicated ourselves to maximizing quality control, and we made some real good steps forward. Static electricity has been reduced by using an alpha particle emitter that cuts down on static. The pellets materials are handled more efficiently. We've reduced that by more than 20%. The production efficiency for making them has been improved by more than 30%. And the pellet content is now assayed for each pellet batch. And we also measure the PZP bioactivity in each batch by titer testing responses in mice. And we never did that before. Testing of pellet shelf life, maximum shelf life, as I mentioned, is in progress. And we are also comparing polymer release characteristics from several different polymer sources because we had an issue with that several years ago. So much for pellet facts. Next thing I would like to discuss is basically the subject, and we know that a lot of horses are rounded up by helicopter. That was one of my favorite things to do for a number of years, was to ride around in the helicopter and count horses after we treated them for foals. What I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about some projections that we have made in the past several months that we've worked on using the Cedar Mountain data from the Annenberg project as our reference base. And these projections are not actually modeling in the sense of a population biologist doing models. They are just projections that we've used based on estimates of the percentage of the population that is mares and their foaling productivity. So we're looking at a starting population of 1,000 horses. That's pretty common. The sex ratio of 1 to 1, which is not always true, but that's what we chose. If it isn't true, it's usually more males than females. So we're being a little conservative. Mares as a percent of the population is about 38%. And the foaling rate, based on the annual foaling rates in untreated populations for a number of HMAs, is about 62% average. And the foal survival rate is estimated at about 93%. It varies somewhere between like 93 and 95%. Horses are amazingly healthy creatures. They manage to do things and reproduce so well. When you look at domestic horses, a lot of the problems they have don't exist in the wild horses. Must be something about being in the great outdoors. The gather access that we used is the same one that's been used in several other modeling systems, which is 80%, that about 80% of the horses out there can be accessed for treatment. So what we have here is these projections, and the first one is based on, the one on the left is based on catching the horses and treating them at year 0, which is here, and then at year 3, catching the ones that are above 1,000 and removing them, and then treating everything that's left that you could access would be 80% of the horses that you treated here in year 0, in year 3, and then a second retreatment in this blue line between years 6 and 7. And in that retreatment, horses were not removed. It was a catch, treat, and release. Okay? And that's compared to the untreated. And what we've seen is over a 10-year period, you see a pretty good difference between the number of horses and that have been removed and at year 10. So at year 10, we estimated how many horses were there that would have to be removed to get back to AML at 1,000. And we added them to how many horses were removed altogether. So the right-hand diagram shows you a very similar picture in the first half But the difference is that in the 6th to 7th year, instead of just catch, treating, and releasing, we caught 80% of what was available, 80% of what's out there. We removed 50% of them, and we retreated 50%. So now we've had an original treatment, a retreatment, one retreatment here, and then another retreatment. So they've had 2 retreatments in a 10-year period. So actually 3 accesses to the horses in the course of the 10 years. To look at this a little bit separate from the untreated, I'm just comparing B and here with C. So B was where we removed 1,000 at year 3, okay, and then boosted the rest. Then at year 6 and 7, we retreated them, catch, treat, and released, and they just got released. Compare that to the model that we had where it's actually model C, not model B, where we had accessed the horses again, retreated the mares, and 50% of them, and then the other 50% of the horses were released. So what did this lead us to in terms of numbers? First thing that we saw that impressed us was the total horses removed. So untreated with a removal at year 3, 4,814. Treated with a removal at year 3, but catch, treat, and release at year 7, 2,855. And then treated and removal at year 3, catch, treat, and release 50%. The other 50% we removed, 2,063. What we then did was, in a very crude manner, we estimated based on the BLM published value for a horse's lifetime in captivity of $48,000. We didn't include the cost of gathers, which was approximately $800K for each one. And we also, for the PZP-22 vaccine costs, they turned out to be 0.004% of a given scenario cost, and so were considered to be, in the large picture, insignificant. What really surprised us was the cost. The cost for removing 4,814 horses and keeping them for the rest of their life. That's a huge number. Then looking at it in terms of the cost with using PZP-22 and a treat-retreat program where you have 2 retreatments, about 100 million less over 10 years, and for the 2063, even less, where you treat 50% and release 50% or you treat 50% and remove 50% of what you catch. So what that does for us is simply put us in a perspective which is the potential for managing the horses on the basis of now having this POP-equus population modeling capability with all kinds of possibilities for mixing and matching PZP-22 use with removals. It offers a really promising potential for implementation in the long view of a mixture of approaches for each herd specific, each one being herd specific, to reduce wild horse populations. And I think the key here is that we've been doing for so long trying to play constantly catch up with more horses than we have room for. And this is going to, I think, based on the models we saw here today and on what we're projecting, is going to allow us over a period of a couple of cycles, maybe 10 to 15 years, to get ahead of this game and actually end up with the ability to partially remove horses as needed and then to use fertility control to reproduce reproductive rates. And I think that's a critical thing. So that's the end of the first one. I hate to tell you this, but I'm going to be up here for another 20 minutes to talk about the new developments that we've been doing. So as part of this gleeful experience of saying, gee, there is hope, using contraception, and it looks like Gonacon and PZP offers the BLM an additional option, having more than one type of control method for controlling reproductive rates. So what we've been doing with PZP-22 is trying to improve the efficacy. And so the approach is to improve the adjuvant, make it more potent, ensure that it's still safe, compatible with controlled release formulations, then to work with recombinant ZP to replace PZP and dramatically reduce the cost of the vaccine. And it gives you a well-characterized and consistent product. And then in the controlled release area to get more reproducible controlled release, higher effectiveness, and be able to administer it in darts. And we now know that we can administer it in darts. So I'm going to talk a little bit about three things: the adjuvant development that's going on, the controlled release development that's going on, and a new approach that we're looking at for non-surgical sterilization that takes away all of those issues about tearing the ovaries out. Adjuvant development, you already heard several times about what the adjuvant is doing. The adjuvant is maximizing the ability of the immune system of the recipient to recognize the foreign protein, which is in our case, the zona pellucida. And it operates sort of by this process where you have dendritic cells, especially these cells in the lymph nodes that convert into other cells that end up working on plasma cells to produce antibodies. And so that's the goal. Our approach now is the use of a combination adjuvant. And we start with the adjuvant Nano 11, which is basically a derivative of sweet corn, okay? And we combine that with a poly-IC adjuvant and a CpG adjuvant, and these two adjuvants are basically influencing gene transcription, okay? So that all goes into a single unit because the Nano 11 serves as a carrier for the other two. And that's shown diagrammatically here. So you have the carrier, you have the Nano 11, which is the circle, then you have the CpG and the poly-IC all together. They're going to go into the body, and they're going to cause some changes in the immune system function, which will lead to gene transcription, and the ultimate goal is an increase in the production of several important cytokines, which are important chemicals that mediate the activity of the immune system. What I would just show you here is that we have been looking at the antibody response in horses to this Nano 11 complex. And what we've been finding is that if you just take the Nano 11 itself, okay, the anti-OVA IgG titer, that is the antibody titer, is not nearly as great over time as if you use the combined adjuvant, which is the Nano 11 with the poly-IC and the CPG. So this is very promising because the adjuvant that we use in pellets is QA21, which is a saponin-based adjuvant. Probably doesn't mean much to many of you, but the point is that it's a decent adjuvant, but it's not nearly as powerful as modifying Freund's complete adjuvant. This adjuvant is. And so we now have a water-soluble adjuvant that we're going to begin testing in horses with PZP. We were just looking here at antibody titers, okay? What we're going to do eventually is to take this adjuvant and test it on the ability to prevent fertilization in horses. The next thing on this list is the recombinant adjuvant. And I won't talk much about this, but basically the value of the recombinant is that you can take the ZP proteins, there's 4 of them, and you can introduce the information that's coding for these proteins into a carrier, a bacterial carrier, and then you can incubate this carrier, okay, with these recombinant cells, and you can produce large quantities of a product, which is your antigen, and it's synthetic. In a way, it's kind of like what GnRH is synthetic. It's not derived from pig ovaries, for example, like PZP is. So the goal is to have a recombinant because it gives you a much cleaner thing, and you can produce very large quantities at a very low cost. I think that you heard that Jenny said that Dan, I think, said that the cost of the Gonacon, the GnRH, is about, would you say, $25 a dose? Okay, and or per milliliter, I mean, and so maybe $50 a dose. And so that kind of cost is the kind of cost we could be looking at for PZP instead of a couple $100 that it is now. So for those 2 studies, these are the acknowledgments, the people who were involved primarily in this. And the primary investigator here in this thing was Harm Hoganesh at Purdue University, and these are his assistants, and in the veterinary area and in food science. And at the University of Toledo, myself and my lab tech, Nilanjana Saffron. And this project is funded by the BLM and Baker's Trust. So the next thing I want to talk about a little bit is controlled release development. And we've been looking at projects in conjunction with Ohio State University at ways to increase the titer responses that we get relative to the pellets we've been using. Because we've been using the same pellets that we are not, I don't mean the same ones in real time, but in terms of the same preparation of pellets that we've been using for the past 20 years, 18 years. And so we think we can improve on that because technology has clearly moved forward. So we've done one experiment in which we had 12 horses, a control group with PZP-22, and then some newly designed emulsion and newly designed capsules that have different release characteristics and hopefully will be more potent. And so we gave all the horses an initial primer injection of the PZP, and then we took blood samples across 12 months and measured antibody titers through the assay lab at Purdue University. And we did ultrasound to test for estrus cycling and to image where the implanted capsules were. Now, these capsules are not like those micro pellets at this stage. They're not like the micro pellets I showed you. These capsules are actually about 3 times that size. But we're just looking for proof of concept here, and we will be moving to the actual reduced size version when we have that. So this is what it looks like. The PZP pellets down here, and then the 1-month emulsion and a 1-year PLGA. We haven't been able to test the 1 year yet because we're still incubating this stuff in the horses. But we have gotten the 1-month response and we've gotten a 3-month response. And you can see that in absolute numbers, both of these 2 new preparations are giving us greater, tighter responses than the pellets that we normally use. So that's very promising. However, you see the size of these error bars, they're huge. And what that tells us is we're not using enough animals to do this. And we knew that from the outset. This was just a proof of concept. And what I would say at the end of this is we need to have more animals in a group. And for that, we beg the BLM to provide us with some of the 70,000 captive wild horses to do that at some point in time. So the next experiment is looking at PZP from different sources. There are 2 major sources of PZP. One is produced at the Science and Conservation Center in Billings. The other is produced in California by Dr. Irwin Liu, who was the person who first produced PZP in the 1980s. And those 2 sources have been used for various studies over a long number of years, and we wanted finally to be able to compare their effectiveness. So we looked at 3 groups. Notice the small numbers. We started out with 3 each. 2 of the horses had to be euthanized for health problems that were unrelated to this study. And the 3rd group was the SCC PZP from Montana. Notice that the Liu PZPs, there were 2 of them. One was from 2016, one was from 2018, and the Montana PZP was 2018. So we gave a primer emulsion injection, and then we followed it in 7 weeks with a booster emulsion. And we took blood samples at these times, and this is what it looked like. So you can see that initially it looks like you have the 2018 Liu giving the greatest response in titer to the booster, the 2018 SCC giving the next best, and the 2016 PZP giving the next best. And we have the same problem with these data that we had with the previous data. Very large error bars. So in actuality, even though it looks like these are different, they're statistically not. And one of the reasons why I think it's really important, because each horse has its own immune system and responds according to stimuli. And here's an example where we have the 2 horses that were in the 2016 PZP preparation that got that preparation. Here's horse 96 and here's horse 320. Look at the titer responses. 96 showed this mediocre titer response. 320 showed a titer response as good or better than any of the other 2 preparations. And so this kind of variability, you can only deal with it by having large numbers of animals in the assessment. And it costs more money to do that, but the point is, why do this when you can't determine what the reality is, okay? So we need more horses. This just shows you that there was no statistical significance differences between weeks, and there was no difference between the PZP sources in the titer response at a 0.06p level. So That's the message. That the outcomes of these studies indicate that access to increased numbers of horses per study group, we recommend a minimum of 10, henceforth, is necessary to establish the most reliable conclusions. So if an agency or an organization is going to fund a project that's going to do this stuff and bring it to a real viable conclusion, the money has to be increased to the extent that we can work with larger numbers of horses. There are two ways to do that. If you use university horses, you're talking about $20 a day per horse. And that doesn't include any manipulations that you do. That gets added on. So that's why we turn to the BLM and say, BLM, how do we set these experiments up so that we can have access to these horses? All we're doing is measuring titers. We're giving them a simple injection, and we're taking blood samples periodically to measure titers. This is a routine thing that all horses experience if they ever get into captivity, because you want to check for certain things in the horse's well-being. So it's nothing new, it's nothing special, but it's very important. There. So I wanted to acknowledge, again, the funding for this project is the BLM. What would we ever do without the BLM? We couldn't. The BLM has kept this going for so many years, and it's demonstrated that BLM has a dedication to finding solutions for this horse population problem. I respect that, and I just want to see this taken to the next level, where we begin a more aggressive approach to mix removals and fertility control. But I'm not the head of the Department of Interior. So, that's it. Thanks for your time. I really appreciate that you sat here for so long. Medical students really get bored after about 20 minutes. So, thank you.